The beginning of a shocking journey. The Second World War was one of the darkest and most destructive chapters in human history. It reshaped nations, destroyed cities, and transformed millions of lives. By the early 1940s, Nazi Germany believed it was unstoppable. Their military campaigns across Europe appeared victorious. Their technology, tanks, aircraft, and rockets seemed unmatched. German soldiers trusted that they were fighting for a nation destined to rule the future. From childhood, they had grown up under the powerful influence of Nazi propaganda. In schools, books, radio broadcasts, and newsreels, they were taught that Germany was the strongest, most advanced country in the world. They were told that America was weak, divided, and incapable of fighting a real war. Propaganda described the United States as a land of chaos, filled with crime, hunger, racial conflict, and poverty. They were told that American soldiers were soft, unskilled, and badly trained. Most German soldiers believed these lies without question. But the truth would soon shock them in a way they could never have imagined. By 1943, the war had started to turn. Germany suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps was forced to surrender. Allied bombing campaigns struck German cities day after day. Supplies were shrinking, food was disappearing, and morale dropped. Many soldiers began to ask each other quietly, "Is everything we were told actually true? Is America really weak? Why are the Allies growing stronger every day?" Thousands of German soldiers were captured in battles across Europe and North Africa. At first, most of them were terrified. They believed that if they surrendered to Americans, they would be tortured or executed. That was what the propaganda had said. But instead, they received surprising news. They would be transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. For many of them, this was the beginning of one of the greatest psychological shocks of the entire war. A new world across the ocean. The journey to America was long. Packed onto transport ships, guarded but treated fairly, the prisoners silently wondered what awaited them. Rumors spread among the men. Will we be starved? Will we be beaten? Will we be put to work like slaves? Some expected to see a land destroyed by war, filled with broken cities and hungry people. Others expected chaos and violence. But when the ships finally reached American shores, what they saw changed their beliefs forever. The first view of the American coastline struck them like lightning. Instead of ruins and destruction, they saw massive factories and steel mills operating day and night, busy harbors filled with hundreds of ships, endless trains carrying supplies across giant rail networks, thousands of cars and trucks moving constantly, active cities glowing with electric lights. One prisoner later wrote, "When we arrived in the United States, we expected ruins. German propaganda told us the Americans were poor and starving. But what we saw was industry beyond imagination. Factories stretched farther than the eye could see. The smoke from the chimneys meant production, power, energy. At that moment, I realized, Germany could never win this war." Thousands of German POWs felt exactly the same shock. They had never witnessed industrial power on such a scale. In Germany, cities were burning after months of bombing. Buildings lay in rubble. Food was rationed. Factories had been destroyed. Families struggled to survive. But in America, nothing looked touched by war. First moments on American soil. When the prisoners stepped off the ships, they were confused. American guards did not scream at them. They did not beat them. Instead, they were organized calmly, checked medically, and transported to clean, well-prepared prisoner-of-war camps located across the country. Many were shocked that the guards smiled and spoke politely. Some American soldiers even offered cigarettes or chocolate. One POW remembered, "That was the moment I understood everything we were told about America was a lie." Inside the camps, they found rows of wooden barracks, warm beds, blankets, bathrooms with running water, cafeterias, recreation fields, and even libraries. Some camps offered classes, music, and sports. Their meals included meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and sometimes desserts. food richer than most civilians in Germany were eating at the time. Some POWs wrote in their diaries, "We eat better here as prisoners than our families do at home." The shock was immediate and deep. America's industrial might soon after arriving, many German prisoners were assigned to work on farms, in lumber yards, and in local factories, always under the rules of the Geneva Convention, and always paid for their labor. What they saw in those factories left them speechless. There were assembly lines producing trucks, airplanes, machinery, and weapons at a speed they had never thought possible. Huge machines operated with precision and power. Thousands of workers, men and women, worked like a synchronized engine. Many POWs later said, "When we saw how much America could produce in a single day, we understood that Germany had already lost. It was only a matter of time." Some factories produced more in 1 month than Germany could build in a year during wartime. Germany had been fighting a war it could never win, and they realized it too late. Life inside the American camps for the German prisoners of war, the first days in the United States were filled with confusion, anxiety, and deep curiosity. Nothing they saw matched what they had been taught. Every detail of their new surroundings seemed to challenge everything they once believed. When they entered the POW camps, they expected harsh conditions, cold barracks, cruel guards, constant hunger, and endless punishment. Instead, they found something completely different. A new reality behind the fences. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and soldiers armed with rifles watched carefully. But inside the fences, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. The barracks were clean and organized. Beds were lined in straight rows. Each prisoner was given blankets, pillows, clean clothing, and hygiene supplies. There were showers with hot water, something many had not experienced in months during the war. Meals were served 3 times a day, and they often included bread, butter, and jam, meat such as beef or pork, potatoes and vegetables, fresh fruit and coffee. It was more food than most German families had at home. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "When I saw the food on the table, I thought it was a trick. Why would the enemy feed us so well? It was then that I began to question everything we had been told." Another said, "Back home, my mother stood in line for hours to get a small loaf of bread. Here we ate bread every day without fear it would run out." The contrast between life inside the camp and life in wartime Germany shocked them deeply. American treatment of the prisoners. The guards were strict but respectful. They followed the rules of the Geneva Convention and did not humiliate or beat the prisoners. They gave orders firmly, but they spoke calmly. Some guards even greeted the men, wished them good morning, or asked about their health. To the POWs, this felt unreal. They had expected hate, brutality, and humiliation. Instead, they encountered fairness and discipline, something they were not used to within the Nazi military system, where fear and punishment were common methods of control. One prisoner remembered, "I had never been treated with such dignity, even in my own army. We were ordered, threatened, and beaten by our own officers. Here, the enemy treated us like human beings." This unexpected kindness left many confused and ashamed. They began to wonder whether they themselves had been the villains. Work and daily responsibilities to keep the camps productive and orderly. POWs were allowed, and sometimes required, to work. This was not slave labor. They were paid a small wage, usually in camp currency, which they could use to buy items in small stores, such as soap, toothbrushes, razors, notebooks and pencils, cigarettes, chocolate or coffee. The prisoners worked in farms during harvest seasons, lumber and forestry at remote sites, factories producing non-military goods. Construction and maintenance teams working outside the fences exposed them to the everyday reality of American society, and what they saw astonished them even more. They expected destroyed cities and desperate people. Instead, they saw clean streets, well-fed families, stores full of goods, children laughing and playing, new cars driving everywhere. It was the complete opposite of wartime Germany, where ruins filled the cities and food shortages were severe. One POW recalled, "I looked at the American workers. They worked hard, but they were not afraid. They were not hungry. They were not desperate. They worked because they chose to, not because they were forced." For many German soldiers, this was the first time they had witnessed freedom. The shock of America's industrial strength inside American factories, the POWs witnessed industrial efficiency on a massive scale. Assembly lines moved at incredible speed. Machines were larger and more advanced than anything they had seen. Workers, both men and women, operated as a powerful, coordinated force. Production was continuous, day and night. A German engineering officer reportedly said, "If America can build airplanes and tanks at this speed, then the war is already lost. Germany cannot match this capacity." Another POW said, "I watched a factory complete more trucks in 1 week than Germany could produce in a month. It was the moment I realized the truth: we had been lied to." The prisoners talked among themselves late at night in the barrack. They whispered about what they had seen and what it meant. Some resisted the truth, still clinging to hope that Germany might turn the war around. But others accepted reality. Their worldview was changing day by day. Cultural shock among the Americans most surprising of all, the Americans did not appear to hate them. Civilians who interacted with POWs did not shout insults or seek revenge. Many were curious, polite, or even friendly. Some shared food or cigarettes. Farmers who hired POWs sometimes invited them to meals at the family table. One prisoner said, "We thought America was full of angry savages. Instead we found ordinary people living ordinary peaceful lives. It made me wonder, why are we fighting them?" They also noticed something remarkable: Americans freely expressed opinions about the government, the president, and the war. People criticized leaders openly without fear. Freedom of speech was something they had never experienced. Naive POWs thought it was dangerous to speak against leaders. They were shocked that in America disagreement was normal and accepted. This stunned them more than anything else. America's strength came not from force, but from freedom and unity. A quiet transformation. What began as confusion slowly became reflection. The prisoners started writing letters home, describing the unbelievable reality they were experiencing. Some wrote, "Everything we were told was propaganda. The Americans are nothing like we were taught. Germany has no chance to win." Many experienced a deep internal conflict. They had sworn loyalty to Hitler. They had risked their lives for the Reich. Now they began to doubt everything. For the first time, they wondered if they had been fighting for the wrong cause. It was a painful realization, one that would change the rest of their lives. Breaking the walls of belief as the weeks turned into months, something deep and unexpected began to happen inside the minds of thousands of German prisoners. The shock they felt when arriving in America slowly evolved into a quiet internal struggle. Everything they saw around them challenged the foundation of their beliefs, beliefs they had carried since childhood. Many of them had spent their entire lives inside a closed world controlled by fear and propaganda. Now, for the first time, they were seeing reality for themselves. They were no longer soldiers under orders. They were observers, thinking, watching, questioning. The transformation did not happen overnight. It started with small conversations, curious observations, and silent comparisons. Every day inside the American camps slowly chipped away at what they once believed to be true. Conversations that changed minds inside the camps. The prisoners often gathered in groups at night, sitting on bunk beds or on the wooden floors, speaking quietly. They discussed what they had seen in the factories, on the farms, and in the American towns. They compared it to what they remembered from home: the ruins, the hunger, the endless bombing sirens, the fear of the Gestapo. Some conversations were emotional and intense. One night, a former German officer shouted in frustration, "If what we see here is real, then everything we fought for was a lie." Another soldier answered, "I never cared about politics. I just followed orders." Now I don't know what to believe. And then a young soldier, barely 19, said quietly, "My village is gone. My family might be dead. What did we gain?" Silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that meant everyone understood, but no one wanted to say the next sentence. They had been fighting for a future that no longer existed. Americans who changed their hearts. The unexpected kindness from American civilians deeply affected many prisoners. Farmers often worked alongside them in the fields, speaking slowly so they could understand. Some even shared meals on Sundays after work, something unimaginable between enemies. One POW recalled, "A farmer's wife handed me a cup of milk. I was shaking. Why would she be kind to me? My army had destroyed her sons and brothers. But she smiled and said, 'War will end someday.' I will never forget her face." Another prisoner remembered seeing American children running and playing freely. In Germany, children played among ruins. Here they played in parks. "I realized this is what life could be like without war." Many prisoners were shocked by the equality they witnessed. They worked side by side with white and black Americans, something strictly forbidden in Nazi Germany. They watched people of different races eat together, talk together, and treat each other as equals. It was one of the strongest blows against Nazi belief. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We were told that Germany was superior, that we were the master race. But here I see that America is powerful because everyone works together. They respect each other. That is strength, not hatred." Cracks in the ideology. Not all prisoners changed their views easily. Some still clung fiercely to Nazi ideology. They formed secret groups inside the camps, trying to intimidate anyone who questioned Germany or criticized Hitler. They threatened those who expressed admiration for America. These prisoners called themselves true believers. They whispered warnings: "Do not trust the Americans. Never forget your loyalty. Germany will rise again." But every day, the truth became harder for them to deny. They could not ignore the endless trains carrying manufactured goods, the brand new aircraft flying overhead, the massive highways filled with vehicles, the families living without fear, the full grocery stores, the freedom of speech everywhere. One POW, who had once been a strong believer, finally admitted, "I kept trying to believe the lies. But reality was stronger. Propaganda could not survive contact with truth." The moment of realization, the most powerful transformation, many prisoners described, happened not in the camps, but inside American cities. On rare occasions, buses transported POW work groups through towns. People looked at them, but not with hatred. Some waved. Some simply continued with their day. Life went on. One prisoner said, "I expected angry crowds spitting at us. Instead I saw people working, smiling, living normal lives. No one cared that we were enemies. For the first time, I felt small." That moment humbled them. It made them understand something painful. They had been fighting a war against people who never wanted to fight them. They realized the truth about Nazi Germany, that it had used fear, lies, and manipulation to control millions. They realized that while they believed they were fighting for glory and honor, they were actually fighting for a dictator who had destroyed their country. New friendships in some camps. American guards taught English to the prisoners. They played soccer and volleyball with them. Music groups formed. Some POWs learned American songs. They read books from the camp library, books banned in Germany. One prisoner described reading his first American newspaper. "I was shocked that the newspaper criticized the American president. In Germany, such a thing meant execution. Here, it was normal. That day, I understood what freedom truly means." Friendships began to grow quietly and carefully. And friendships can do what guns never can: change hearts. One American guard said many years later, "They arrived as enemies. They left as human beings." Breaking the chains of fear inside every German prisoner, a huge internal battle took place. They were fighting a war inside themselves now, a war between what they were taught, what they were seeing, who they used to be, Who they might become some nights, men cried silently in their beds. Others stayed awake thinking about their families back home, suffering while they slept in warm beds in America. Many wrote letters asked to be returned home not to fight, but to rebuild. They now understood that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its freedom, unity, and humanity. The prisoners who once believed they were superior now realized the painful truth. We were not the strongest nation. We were simply the most deceived. And their transformation was only beginning. The collapse of the Old World, the winter of 1944-1945, was one of the most emotional periods for the German POWs in America. News from Europe slowly began reaching the camps more often. The prisoners heard rumors about cities destroyed, families displaced, and the German army collapsing on both fronts. At first, many did not believe it. They had been taught that Germany was invincible, that victory was guaranteed. But the radio broadcasts, newspapers, and letters from the Red Cross told a different story, a story harder to deny each day. One afternoon, a group of prisoners stood around a bulletin board inside the camp. The guard posted a newspaper article showing photographs of ruined German cities. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, places once full of life, now reduced to ash. Some stared silently. Others turned away, unable to look. One man whispered, "My home was there. Just there." Another soldier, holding the newspaper with shaking hands, said, "We lost everything. And for what?" And for the first time, many of them cried openly. Not because of defeat, but because the truth was now undeniable. The emotional breaking point, some prisoners felt anger, not at America, but at their own leaders. They felt betrayed, lied to, used like tools. They began to understand that Hitler and the Nazi regime had never cared about them, their families, or their future. One POW wrote in his diary, "We were told we were heroes. Now I see we were only fuel for a madman's dream." Others felt deep guilt. They thought about the destruction Germany had brought to Europe, to Poland, France, the Soviet Union, the Netherlands, Belgium, and many more. They realized how many innocent lives had been lost. One former SS soldier, once proud and loyal, sat alone at the edge of the barracks and whispered, "I believed everything they said. I never asked questions. Now I must live with the truth." This was not just the fall of an army. This was the collapse of an entire worldview. A quiet revolution inside the camps over time. The mood inside the POW camps changed completely. Instead of discussing military tactics and victories, the prisoners now talked about rebuilding, forgiveness, and the future. Secret Nazi groups tried to influence others, but they were losing power every day. Men who once looked up to the Nazi leadership now spoke openly against them. They learned English faster. They asked to read American books about democracy and freedom. They wanted to understand how a nation could be so powerful without fear and dictatorship. One POW said during a discussion circle organized by American officers, "I thought strength meant silence and obedience. Now I see strength means freedom to speak and freedom to think." The transformation was happening from within, quietly, deeply, permanently. The day the war ended on May 8, 1945, news spread across the camps. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The announcement echoed through the loudspeakers. Some prisoners cheered. Others sat in silence. Many fell to their knees and prayed. One man looked at the sky and whispered, "It's finally over." Another said, "We lost the war. But maybe now we can win peace." For the first time in years, they could imagine a life without bombs, without fear, without uniforms. But there was also fear of the unknown. What would happen when they returned to a country destroyed by war? No one knew. Life inside a changing Germany. Months passed before the prisoners were allowed to go back home. When ships finally carried them across the Atlantic, they returned to a Germany that looked nothing like the one they remembered. Cities were piles of broken stone and twisted metal. Streets were filled with homeless families. Children searched through rubble for food. Factories were silent. Millions were dead. One returning POW wrote, "I walked the streets where I once played as a child. There was nothing left. Only dust and broken memories." People were exhausted, angry, and lost. Many refused to talk about the war. Others wanted revenge. The country was broken, physically, emotionally, and morally. But among the returning prisoners began the first seeds of hope. The builders of a new Germany, unlike many others, the former POWs had seen something different. They had seen a working democracy. They had seen real freedom, respect, and unity. They had seen a world built on cooperation rather than fear. They brought this knowledge back with them. They began teaching others what they had learned. How to rebuild with discipline and teamwork. How to live without hate. How to try democracy. How to respect different opinions. How to choose peace over war. One former prisoner became a teacher. Another became a mayor. Some became engineers and helped rebuild roads and bridges. Others became writers, telling their stories so that future generations would never repeat the same mistake. One man said to his village, "Never again follow a leader without asking questions." Another said, "The strongest nation is not the one that conquers, but the one that builds." Slowly, brick by brick, Germany began to rise again, not as an empire of war, but as a nation of peace. The final lesson years later, when German POWs and American guards met again at reunions, they hugged like old friends. They cried together, laughed together, and shared memories. They were no longer enemies, they were survivors of the same tragedy. One former German prisoner said during a reunion, "America defeated us with weapons. But they won our hearts with humanity." And an American guard answered, "War ends when people stop hating." A lifetime of memory. When the German prisoners returned home after the war, they carried two kinds of memories with them. One was heavy, shaped by bombs, fear, hunger, and loss. The other was unexpected, memories of America that gave them hope for a different future. Many former prisoners said that their time in the United States changed them more than any battle ever could. They had entered the camps as soldiers taught to hate, but left them as men who understood the value of respect, cooperation, and freedom. In Germany, everything was broken. Cities were destroyed, families scattered, and the economy had collapsed. The returning POWs arrived not as proud warriors, but as survivors trying to help rebuild their country from nothing. They felt responsible for building a better future. One former prisoner wrote in his memoir, "War had taken everything from us, but America gave us the idea that life could begin again." They arrived with new ideas, ideas that surprised their neighbors and families. Many Germans had imagined America as a cruel enemy, a land of brutality. But the returning POWs described something different, a nation of hard workers, dreamers, and ordinary people who wanted peace, not destruction. Rebuilding from the ruins in the late 1940s, Germany was like a skeleton of a dead giant. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Roads were shattered. Factories were silent. Food was scarce. Life was slow, painful, and uncertain. The former POWs became some of the most effective rebuilders. They were disciplined, organized, and motivated. Years of work in American farms and factories taught them practical skills. They understood the power of cooperation, time management, fairness, and planning. One former prisoner became a civil engineer and helped rebuild bridges destroyed during the bombing campaigns. He worked long hours, often without pay, because he believed rebuilding was more important than personal comfort. He said, "A bridge is more than steel and stone. It is a promise that people will meet again." Another became a teacher and opened the first school in his devastated town, teaching children about democracy, respect, and peace. He told his students, "Think for yourselves. Never let anyone force you to hate." Slowly, towns came back to life. Windows were repaired. Streets were cleared. Trains ran again. Markets reopened. Farmers plowed the fields. Children laughed again in the parks. Germany was being reborn, not with tanks and propaganda, but with shovels, books, and hope. The seeds of democracy. Many returning prisoners supported Germany's new democratic government. They explained to others how American democracy worked: voting, free speech, debate, fairness in law, and competition without violence. Some people resisted. Old habits were difficult to break. Some still believed in the old ways. But slowly, more and more people listened, because the returning POWs had something valuable: experience. One man told his town meeting, "In America, I worked side by side with people who once were my enemies. They treated me like a human being. If they could do that, then why can't we?" His words spread. People began talking differently. They began to believe that a country did not need fear to be strong. It needed unity, trust, and responsibility. These ideas later helped build the foundation for the Federal Republic of Germany, which grew into a peaceful, democratic, and economically powerful nation. The transformation amazed the world. Friendships that never died. Years after the war, many former German POWs returned to the United States, not as prisoners, but as friends. Some came to visit the camps where they once lived. Others visited the farms where they had worked side by side with American families. They brought gifts, photographs, and letters. They hugged the people who once guarded them behind barbed wire. They ate meals together, laughed together, and spoke about the past. One American woman recalled, "They arrived as strangers. They left as family." Some POWs named their children after Americans who had treated them with kindness. Others kept letters for decades, preserved like treasures. A former prisoner once said during a reunion, "I came to America with hatred in my heart. I left with tears in my eyes." The biggest lesson: with time, many former POWs became authors, historians, and public speakers. They spoke to young students, reminding them of the dangers of blind obedience and the importance of questioning authority. One speaker told a classroom, "The worst prison is not made of barbed wire. It is made of lies." They explained that war is not fought by heroes, but by sons, brothers, and fathers who deserve to live. They said that peace is not just the silence after the guns stop. Peace must be built, protected, and taught. The legacy that lives on decades later. Historians interviewed many former POWs and asked the same question: "What shocked you most when you arrived in America?" Their answer was almost always the same: not the factories, not the machines, not the power, but the kindness. They said America's true strength was not military might, but humanity, the ability to treat even an enemy with dignity. That is what changed minds, changed lives, and changed history. One American guard summarized it perfectly: "We won the war with weapons. We won peace with respect." Today, the story of the German POWs in America remains one of the most powerful examples of transformation, proof that human dignity can defeat hate, and that compassion can rebuild even the most broken world.